Welcome to Breakpoint this week. Got a lot of stories to cover. I'm here with Warren Smith. Warren is on the left coast this week, having spent the week National Religious Broadcasters.
I am here at National. About 3,000, John, folks are here, including a lot of our friends here at the Colson Center and Breakpoint. So it's really fun to see these folks and to talk to them. And here doing a lot of interviews for the podcast. It's kind of a target-rich environment for a guy like me to come and get a lot of interviews all at once. But there's also some real business taking place here as well. The National Religious Broadcasters Board passed a resolution related to fairness for all.
Yeah, that's actually a significant story because if you follow Breakpoint this week, on Thursday actually, I did a commentary on the Equality Act, which is something that literally has been around for 40 years. It dates all the way back to 1979. It's amazing. But of course, for the last 30 years, it didn't have a chance of passing. And what the Equality Act tries to do is to elevate sexual orientation and now gender identity, although that wasn't always part of the deal, to the same status as race, and basically extending the same protections that are part of the Civil Rights Act of 1969 to gays, lesbians, transgender, and so on. So it's a radical bill. I mean, what it would do essentially would be to, in many ways, any sense of religious freedom when it comes to having religious conviction, when it comes to sexuality. So that's really what it would do. In response to that, there are Christian organizations, most prominently the CCCU, which stands for the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities. And although not all the member institutions are here, I'm talking about the umbrella organization of the CCCU, and then the National Association of Evangelicals. Again, these are two umbrella groups that have proposed something called Fairness for All. Now, if you've been keeping score from home, this is kind of patterned after the fairness arrangement that was reached in Utah. And the Fairness for All idea is, listen, we'll grant that sexual orientation and gender identity are categories of what it means to be human, and let that be enshrined in law as long as you just allow us to do what we want to do in our own institution. So what Fairness for All essentially does is it grants SOGI laws, sexual orientation and gender identity laws, as legitimate, but then asks for exemptions for Christian organizations. And the NRB just soundly rejected that compromise this week with their resolution that they passed.
Well, they sure did, John, and I got to say that I was pretty proud of them. The National Religious Broadcasters has said many times that it wants to be for the First Amendment what the NRA is to the Second Amendment, and that means, among other things, defending the rights that are in the First Amendment, which includes free speech and religion, freedom of religion. And I think they took a giant step towards meeting that goal by passing this resolution, and I think it was particularly courageous of the NRB to mention the two organizations that you just mentioned, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities and the National Association of Evangelicals, which have taken those steps towards compromise. And they not only call them out, but as part of I don't know if you've ever read these resolutions, but there's a bunch of whereases and then a therefore it is resolved. But one of the things that they resolved to do was to respectfully urge our brothers and sisters in Christ in the CCCU, the NAE, and elsewhere to reject any legislation that does not indisputably uphold the fundamental freedoms of all ministries and individuals to live, believe, and speak faithfully their biblical convictions. So it was a tough but gracious statement, and I got to say I'm pretty proud of them for making it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on their side as well, and I do want to just also thank the NRB, not only for doing it, but for doing it respectfully. I mean, listen, this is a strategic disagreement. It's important to say that the CCCU, although some of their member institutions may be, it seems to me, but as an organization, that umbrella group that covers Christian colleges and universities and the NAE, what they're trying to do is reach a compromise in light of a juggernaut, which is the Equality Act and the various ways that religious freedom has been restricted. They're not compromising morally when it comes to homosexuality or, transgenderism or anything like that. They're trying to make a strategic move in light of what we know are increasing challenges in the name of LGBT rights against religious freedom. And of course, under the last presidential administration, Warren, it was like a freight train. And it's important to understand that the Fairness for All idea was something that was birthed at a time of the Obama administration where the top domestic policy priorities. And in many ways, the top, international policy priorities of that administration had to do with LGBT. And it seemed like there was no space left for religious liberty. And so Fairness for All was really an attempt to kind of carve out some space. I think it's a strategic mistake, but I want everyone to understand that the disagreement is strategic, not doctrinal, at least in my mind. I'm with the NRB. We've written about that. I wrote about it this week in the Breakpoint commentary. It said, look, attempts to compromise that grant sexual orientation and gender identity as a legitimate class of human being are highly problematic for a number of reasons. One of the reasons, Warren, and because you mentioned NRB's commitment to religious freedom, and of course I would say that, our friends at the Alliance Defending Freedom and so many other places play similar roles in terms of what the NRA is to the Second Amendment, these groups are to the First. But one of the ways that this is highly problematic is that while it protects Christian organizations that are kind of official 501c3s, as long as they fit the category of exemption, it will do nothing to protect Barronnelle Stutzman. It will do nothing to protect Jack Phillips. It will do nothing to protect the businessmen. In fact, I was talking with the CEO of a Christian businessmen's ministry, which itself, by the way, is not a nonprofit. It's actually a for-profit organization that gathers Christian CEOs. And he sees Fairness for All almost in the same category as the Equality Act, in the sense that it leaves them on the wrong side of the fence when it comes to religious liberty.
Well, I think it does, and like I say, I'll just repeat it and reiterate it. I'm proud of the NRB for taking the stand that it did. While I do understand that many people supported Fairness for All for good reasons, I agree with you, John. It's a mistake, and I'm glad the NRB made the decision that they did this week.
But let's make this clarion call. And one of the reasons we cover this on Breakpoint is that the Equality Act was essentially unpassable when it was introduced in whatever form in 79 and in 89 and in 99 and in 09. We're just a few senators away, essentially, for this actually becoming a live option. And if it does become a live option, it's a big deal. And what the strategic approach is going to be, if it does become a live option, is going to be a really hard question. So between now and the next election, let me just say, learn what the Equality Act is. Learn what the problems are. Be able to articulate the challenges that the Equality Act poses for religious liberty. This is one of those issues where we need all hands on deck, and we're staring at the next election. And Warren, you and I both made predictions about the last one that were wrong. Do you want to make a prediction about this one?
Well, no.
And so my point is that the Equality Act could be a live option in just a year and a half.
That's right. And one prediction I would be glad to make, John, is that if Christians don't show up and vote, other people are going to make the decisions for us.
You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint This Week. I'm here with Warren Smith. Warren, Jussie Smollett, that is a name that has become a household name. Many of us wouldn't have known who that is just before fiasco that took place in Chicago. He's the star, or I guess a star, of a television show called Empire, claimed to have been beaten up in downtown Chicago in the middle of a polar vortex because he was gay and black by a couple of guys who poured bleach on him, put a noose around his neck, and said something about this is MAGA country, which is very common in downtown Chicago, where people walk around in a polar vortex, claiming to have voted for Trump. Sorry, I'm being a little sarcastic on this one. And the reason is because obviously the initial charge that he was the victim of a hate crime was quickly picked up by our media outlets, who have not had a great track record this year. And then it turned around that the prosecutors there in Chicago said, no, he made it up, which it sure sounded like it from the very beginning to me. And out of nowhere this week, the state attorney's office gave him a kind of a sweetheart deal and dropped all charges. And we were talking, how many charges were there in this case, Warren? Do you remember? I think it was more than a dozen, wasn't it?
There were. Yeah, I don't remember the exact number. My recollection is that there were 19 charges, but you were absolutely right that it was more than a dozen charges. And it's remarkable that all of them were dropped. And, John, you mentioned a bit ago that I'm here at National Religious Broadcasters and get to see a lot of our friends, including J. Warner Wallace, who, of course, used to be a police detective and still occasionally consults with police departments. And I got to tell you, that was the only thing he wanted to talk about, John. He had been interviewed on a couple of radio programs about how the police had just been thrown under the bus by the prosecutor, that the prosecutor had tons of political considerations that he had to deal with. The police were just dealing with the facts, and the police really feel betrayed in this process. And Jim Wallace, Shea Warner Wallace, brought up the fact that there really are moral and ethical considerations here, if you will, worldview issues that are a part of this case. Questions like what's right and what's wrong, what's true and what's false, the rule of law and equal access to the law. Is everyone being treated fairly by the law, or do some get shown privilege based on money and privilege or ideology? And these are really important worldview questions that I think we as Christian citizens need to address.
Well, I appreciate you bringing up these really important worldview questions in such a calm, measured manner. And I know Jay, I'm sure he was livid.
Yeah,
I just immediately got my spiritual gift of sarcasm on. I think I tweeted out within just after hearing this. And, you know, in other news, Jussie Smollett is going to enroll at USC on a rowing scholarship. You know, I mean, it's like we just heard so much about privilege in this whole deal having to do with a college entrance and, you know, the Aunt Becky from Full House and so on. And for many reporters, it was made racial and so on. And this is, again, this shows that privilege doesn't always fall along racial lines in America. Very often it falls along ideological or, money lines. But this is insane. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. Maybe we should have Jay Warner on our podcast and just let him kind of vent for a bit. I mean, he's a really obviously brilliant apologist and a brilliant worldview thinker. But let's talk for a second, though, again, about media. I mean, the media's had a really bad run. And not only because they've missed a bunch of stories, but because after they've missed a bunch of stories, they apologize and then continue to miss a bunch of stories.
Right.
And I'm thinking about after the 2016 election, you know, Van Jones went on an apology tour for CNN, essentially, saying, you know, we're going to get to know the rest of America that doesn't live on the coast. And that was short-lived. And then you have, of course, the Covington Catholic boys, the school, that story, basically where it was kind of all about these privileged white kids yelling at this Native American elder. And that turned out they missed that story completely. And like I said earlier, I mean, this one wasn't hard in my mind. I mean, there were so many things that smelled really suspicious from the very beginning.
Yep.
It just really wasn't hard. And yet there was no questioning, of course, it was a hate crime, of course. And now you have this. I mean, it's just really hard. And again, by the way, I saw some media outlets again do the mea culpa, like we missed this one again. It's like, well, okay, at some point, though, you have to realize that there's more than one side to America.
Yeah. Well, you do, John, and the problem is that a lot of folks in the mainstream media don't. It's always interesting to me that if the mainstream media had only white people in their newsroom, they would say that's not good, that we need some African Americans or people of color for diversity. If there were only straight people, they would say, no, we need some gay people in our newsroom. At least the liberal progressive journalists would say that. But when they look at their newsroom and see that the only folks in their newsroom are liberal, progressive folks who do not attend church, and there are plenty of statistics that back this up, they don't ever say to themselves that that is a problem, that they need more ideological diversity in their newsrooms. They just assume that in terms of ideology that their position is the right and true position and that they don't need this diversity of opinion in there. These stories highlight one of the insidious ways that media bias creeps in, and that is that they walk in lockstep ideologically. They have only one perspective ideologically, and conservative opinions fly over the opinions of people and fly over America are mostly lost on many in the mainstream media. And this is just, by the way, not my opinion about this, John, but there are lots and lots of surveys that have been done by Pew, that have been done by Robert Lichter, who studies the media, by a fellow named Jim Kuiper at the Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. This is data-driven stuff, and it's pretty obvious, and yet we just see these incidents showing up over and over again.
And if you come to breakpoint.org and click on the button on the homepage there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, we'll link to some of these sources where this sort of media myopia is well documented. In fact, Warren, I don't know if you saw this story, but I mean, the Jussie Smollett case, I think that was Monday or Tuesday, but that was just out of the headlines when on Thursday, The Economist magazine, which is, typically, I think, a pretty careful publication. I wouldn't call it a mainstream media outlet in the same way as kind of the 24-hour news cycle, but they did a feature article on Ben Shapiro and called him one of the main voices in the alt-right. Now, if you know anything about Ben Shapiro, first of all, he's Jewish. Secondly, he is an enemy of the alt-right. He actually needs police protection at some places because of alt-right protests. He's very hard on them. But it was another example of The Economist taking someone who is a conservative, and he is a conservative, you know what I mean? He's not, I wouldn't call him center at all, but at the same time, you have to be ignorant. And I mean that not like in a derogatory way, but like you have to be ignorant and at some level willfully to have interviewed and written a feature article on Ben Shapiro and not realize that he's not part of the alt-right. But it's kind of like, well, if you're on the right of me, you're in the alt-right. And so that happened like almost immediately after. But let me turn the page on this one, though, Warren, because, look, we could blame the media outlets for kind of immediately jumping on a narrative before we know all the facts. But just a few weeks ago, I was in California speaking to a group of grandparents, and here's the backstory. We're talking about how to help the next generation develop discernment. And this very thoughtful guy on the front row said, look, we're not a great example of this in our generation. He said, we're on Facebook sharing articles that agree with us because, we're conservative, on this end of the political spectrum, and we're sharing it before we know all the facts, and we're not showing discernment. And I thought, you know what, that is first of all, good for that grandpa for acknowledging that. And second, as much as I think many of us want to throw the mainstream media outlets under the bus, and they have had a rough year, a lot of us are guilty too.
Well, that's exactly right. There's an old saying, John, we get the government that we deserve. I think to a certain extent we also get the media that we deserve. I can promise you that if media outlets would throw up these kinds of stories that you and I are criticizing and nobody showed up, nobody watched them, nobody paid to see them, their cable fees or their subscription fees, they would stop airing those stories. They would air something else. And so I think we do have to look in the mirror and take our share of the responsibility. Evangelical Christians, at least according to the polls, are about 30% of America. It's evangelicals share in some of the blame for the popularity of these stories. We cannot solve this problem overnight, but we can, as Christians who are discerning in the way we consume the news and the way that we share the news on social media and elsewhere, can be a big part of the solution.
Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link there on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. And we'll link to some of the articles that we mentioned in this segment and in the last segment. And while you're there, check out the Colson Fellows program. We're still taking applications right now for next year's class. 240 people from around the nation, even around the world, are studying with us this year. Worldview, discernment, also kind of a cultural analysis in preparation to develop a 3-year plan to live out their faith where God has placed them in the culture. And that's what Colson Fellows do. And then you join a network of individuals that are literally bringing restoration to areas as diverse as education and law, dealing with families with disability and medicine. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you can find out more information there at our website as well. Stay with us. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Welcome back. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. And, John, you've already mentioned that I'm here at National Religious Broadcasters, and I've shared with you, some of the things that I've seen and heard here, but there's something that someone I haven't seen or heard, and that's Joni Eareckson Tada. She is almost always at NRB, and one of the things that she is known for, popular for, that everybody looks for, is she leads a hymn sing here. And I got to tell you, it's one of the most beautiful moments of NRB every year is to have Joni Eareckson Tada, who has a beautiful voice, from her wheelchair, leading the folks here in some of the great classic hymns of the faith. But unfortunately, this year she's not here because her cancer has recurred.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, she was a featured speaker with us last year at the Wilberforce weekend, and she led the crowd there in a hymn. Right after, by the way, blowing our mind in terms of a critical kind of a worldview analysis of our culture and how it denigrates those with disability through doctor-assisted suicide. And that's only Joni that can both lead you in a hymn and teach you about human dignity in light of the current cultural challenge. I mean, she's just a unique individual. She was certainly deeply loved by Chuck Colson and has continued to be deeply loved by all of us at the Colson Center. And she's been hospitalized. And of course, she posted about this, and we shared it on our social media channels asking people to pray. Since her treatments, the radiation that she had to go through because of her recurring breast cancer has led to significant pain, difficulty breathing. And so she's under examination at the hospital. And, you know, even last year when she was with us, we were so honored because she had just come out of some of those treatments for her to join us at the Wilberforce weekend. But it was clear to a lot, despite how wonderful her talk was, how challenging it was, how present she was with so many people, she was in a lot of pain. And so we pray that God gives the doctors wisdom. We pray that God gives Ken, her husband, and Joni grace and supernatural healing. I mean, there are people that, you know, when they're missing, you know it. I mean, you saw it this week at NRB. When she's missing, I mean, there's 3,000 people at NRB, but Joni's missing and everybody knows it. And that's significant. So we need to be in prayer for her.
Well, it really is. And you said it just exactly right, John. She is one of a kind. I mean, the contributions that she has made to my life, helping me to think clearly about issues that I would probably prefer not to think about at all, and to do so in such a gracious and loving way, a powerful way, has just been... you know, she's in some ways in God's providence has been irreplaceable over the last decade or two as these issues related to life and disability and end-of-life issues have become more and more prominent in our public conversations.
Yeah, you know, you kind of look back at some of the early footage from her movie, from when she was on the stage at a Billy Graham crusade. And in fact, I was talking to one of our employees just today, Warren, about this, and she's like, I didn't realize she was 69, you know? I mean, you kind of think of her still as a young woman, but she's got about 50 years in ministry now, and it's really stunning. And by the way, since we're on the kind of the on this track of talking about incredible stories that God worked out, incredible redemption stories, in addition to asking our audience here to pray for Joni Eareckson Tada, I want to ask our audience to go out this weekend and see a movie. I think one of your interviews, Warren, this week was with Abby Johnson, and her film, Unplanned, or the film about her life, Unplanned, is one that is getting an awful lot of attention. And, you know, coming off the heels of the Kermit Gosnell movie, and now this movie, we're getting kind of a flurry of films, hopefully, that will be a powerful tool in changing both hearts and minds when it comes to the dignity of life at the beginning of life.
Well, that's right. And as you said, John, as you and I are having this conversation, I've had the privilege of just a couple of hours ago of interviewing Abby Johnson, and I hope everybody will tune in within the next couple of weeks. We'll get it on the Breakpoint podcast. But she is a remarkable woman. She started volunteering for Planned Parenthood in college, and as soon as she graduated, they hired her. She worked her way up in that organization to become the director of an abortion facility, and increasingly had qualms about her work there, ultimately decided to leave. And, you know, in one of the ironies, one of those kind of amazing twists, she was going to go quietly away from Planned Parenthood. She was just going to look for another job. While she was working for Planned Parenthood, the folks that were outside the abortion facility protesting would often say to her, if you ever decide to leave the industry, come see us and we'll help you. Well, she did that, and they did help her find a job, and she was just going to go quietly, but Planned Parenthood sued her. And that's what really turned her into a public figure that led to a best-selling book and is now leading to this movie. And it was a real privilege to get to chat with her today. And I agree with you. I sure hope people go out and see that movie this week.
Yeah, of course, one of the ironies is that the movie, in large part because it actually pictures at some level an abortion, as I understand it. I haven't seen the film. I've missed a bunch of screenings, and I'm kicking myself because I've just missed it. But the movie was given an R rating. And I think that's one of the incredible talking points that folks can use to make a difference using this film, is that, you know, a minor cannot go see this film because it pictures an abortion. But in many states, a minor could go get an abortion without parental permission. I mean, what an incredible irony. You can't see the movie, but you can actually get an abortion. And, look, these inconsistencies about abortion are just becoming more and more obvious in the culture. And it is our job as Christians to lovingly, truthfully be informed and be able to articulate these views. And so that's why we do what we do at the Colson Center. Find out more. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast. You can also consider joining us at the Wilberforce weekend, May 16th through the 19th. And I say the 16th because really on Thursday night, for the first time, we're going to host a very special event at the Museum of the Bible with Eric Metaxas and John Lennox, one of the infamous Socrates in the City events. And our good friend Eric Metaxas is going to interview one of the smartest guys on the planet, John Lennox. Come to wilberforceweekend.com. That's wilberforceweekend.com. And you can find out more about the entire weekend, including the special event at the Museum of the Bible, Thursday, May 16th. Well, thanks for joining us today. We'll be back again next week to talk about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. See you next time.